Genesis 28 records a revealing instance of God demonstrating how He is ministering to His people through this avenue of angels. God gave a man named Jacob this dream. Let me read it to you. It's found in verses 10 through 12 of chapter 28, the book of Genesis. Jacob went from Beersheba and went to Haran. So he came to a certain place and he stayed there all night because the sun had then set. And he too took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. And then he dreamed, and this is what he dreamed. A ladder was set up on earth, its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending. And so in this dream, God not only showed Jacob, but the rest of us, the way He often chooses to minister to us. And so He showed him this ladder that reached from earth to heaven, and on that ladder, angels were running up and down. This is where we get the phrase, Jacob's ladder. But it really wasn't Jacob's ladder at all. More correctly, it should be identified as God's ladder, upon which the angels of the Lord climb back and forth from heaven to earth. Now, I doubt seriously that there is a real ladder. There may be, but the point of this dream and of this instance was not to tell us that there is a fixed ladder, a literal fixed ladder that runs from heaven to earth, but instead, the point of the dream was to help us, and Jacob in particular, understand the role of these unseen creatures, messengers from God. Now let's continue reading in Genesis 28 and going on to verses 13 through 15. And behold, the Lord stood above it. The Lord was standing above this angel ladder, and He said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Now, in this dream that God gave to Jacob, there are two very important principles that I want to share with you this morning. The first being the ministry of angels. How God uses these unseen, most times unseen, sometimes we entertain angels unaware. But the role that God has ascribed to this segment of His creation, that He often charges them with ministering to you and me. And it as if they are running up and down this ladder, coming from heaven to you, ministering God's blessing and help and grace to you, and then running back up to heaven and waiting a further charge from the Lord. The second principle that we glean from this dream that Jacob had was what God intended Jacob to deeply understand. Now, essentially, what God said to Jacob about blessing him and all of his descendants was a part of what is known as the Abrahamic covenant. Say with me. Jacob's grandfather was Abraham. And remember, God promised Abraham that he would bless him in a similar, very similar fashion as God told Jacob he would bless him. And so Jacob then understood that he indeed stood under the blessing of his grandfather Abraham. That God was affirming to him that Jacob, you are part of the blessing I gave to your grandfather, and it is through you that I will continue to bless and give all of these promises. Now, I read that and thought through that, and this question came to my mind. Why was it that God felt he needed to affirm this covenant with Jacob? Jacob knew of his grandfather's covenant. He knew of the promises of God to his grandfather and his grandfather's descendants, of whom Jacob was one. So why then, in this ministry to angels, or about angels, did God want or sense the need to affirm to Jacob this promise of the blessing of the covenant? And hang with me, because I think you will find this not only very important, but it will be a huge blessing to you. Why did God feel the need to do that? Well, let's think about the man Jacob and who he was. Had we lived Jacob's life, had we walked in his shoes, had we chosen the decisions Jacob had chosen, I guarantee you, as God led us out, we would have wondered, God, are you still going to include me in this thing? Jacob had to be wondering. He had to be worrying. He had to have great concern. God, are you really going to include me in this blessing to my grandfather? If there ever were a black sheep in the family, Jacob gets the vote. His name meant trickster. He lived his whole life up to that point in trickery and deceit. Now, if we had walked in his shoes, we would have wondered, God, after everything I've done, after the way I've lived, after the choices I've made, carrying this deceit and lie in my heart, God, really, are you going to include me in this? Well, let's look at a couple of the things that Jacob did. Genesis 25 records the story of Jacob stealing his brother's birthright. Jacob put a con on his brother to steal from him something that was very, very precious and important in that day. You remember that Jacob and his brother Esau were twins, but Esau came first. And because he was the firstborn, he received the birthright. We're told the story went like this. Esau had been out in the field, working or hunting, likely one of the two. And when he came in, he was exhausted and famished. Well, Jacob, while Esau was out in the field, had been cooking. And he had made some kind of savory stew that just drew Esau into the kitchen. And Esau said, I am starving. I am tired and I am starving. Please give me that stew. And Jacob, the conniver, the trickster, said, you know, brother, I'll tell you what. You sell me the right of the firstborn, and I will give you the stew. I will trade this stew for the right of the firstborn. The right of the firstborn, again, had great importance. First of all, the firstborn birthright received a double inheritance from the father. Everybody else got a portion, but the firstborn got a double portion. Secondly, when the father of the family passed on, the firstborn in the family took the leadership and the headship of the clan and of the family. And so Esau, as hungry and exhausted as he was, made a deal with the devil, and he traded his birthright for the stew. But he wasn't finished. Because not only did he steal the birthright, but he later stole the blessing of the firstborn. Jacob this time worked in concert with his mother, Rebekah. And they tricked the old man, Isaac, into giving Jacob the blessing instead of Esau. At this point in time, as recorded in Genesis 27, Isaac was old and blind, and he knew that his time was short. And so he called upon his eldest son, and he said, Esau, go out into the fields and kill some animal, and from that animal make me a meal. And after we finish eating, we're going to enter into this holy time, this period of covenant, where I am going to pass on to you my blessing. Well, Rebekah and Jacob overheard what was going to be done. And so Rebekah set up a counter plan so that her favorite, Jacob, might deceive the old man Isaac so that Jacob would receive this holy blessing from the father. He'd already stolen the birthright, and he's about to connive to get the blessing. So here's what the mama did. Here's what Mama Rebekah did. She said, son Jacob, I want you to go and get 2 young goats. Bring them back to me, and I'm going to prepare Isaac's favorite meal. And after you bring the goats to me, then you go into Isaac's room, file through his drawers and in his closet, and you find some clothes of Isaac's of Esau's that has Esau's smell on them, and you put Esau's clothes on. And then, after killing the goats and using them to prepare this meal, Mama Rebecca took the skin off of the goats and somehow glued it onto Jacob's arms, because Esau was a hairy man and Jacob is called smooth-skinned. And so this is an intentional deception worked by mom and son to steal this holy blessing from the father. And so they worked the plan. And Jacob brought the meal that Rebekah had prepared to Isaac, and Isaac began to eat, and he felt Jacob's arms, and because he was so blind, he was in fact deceived, thinking Jacob was Esau. And Isaac then spoke the holy blessing of God upon Jacob, thinking he was Esau. Well, as soon as this happened, Esau comes in the room. He doesn't know what has taken place. And when he tells his father, "Father, this is Esau," they realize what has happened. And Esau begs his father, "Well, can't you bless me too? Can't I have a portion of the blessing?" And Isaac said, "No. This is a holy thing, and I've already passed it on to your brother Jacob." Well, you can imagine how irate Esau was at this deception by his brother. And so the Bible tells us that Esau hated Jacob at that time, and so Jacob takes off. And it is in this country, this wilderness area, then that Jacob lays his head down and God gives him this dream. So again, if you're Jacob and you have you have manipulated your brother for the birthright, and then you have conned your father, out of your brother's blessing, there is a big hole in your heart. You are filled with deception. Lie is the basis of your life. Manipulation and scheming and tricking is the way you do life. And so, if I were Jacob and I'm running from my brother for my life, I would be wondering, holy God, are you really going to include me? Am I really still a part of this covenant blessing that you made with my grandfather? My point is this. We find times and moments in the scripture where God uses angels not just to meet our physical needs. 2 weeks ago, we saw how God uses angels at times to bring a holy protection, physical protection around us. But there are also times God uses angels to minister to our deep emotional worries. to our fears, as Jacob runs away from his brother and he is scared for his life. He has left his homeland. What will become of him now? And God speaks to him, showing him first the ladder of angels, and then affirms to him the covenant of his grandfather is upon him. We see God doing the same thing or something similar in the New Testament. God meeting the emotional needs of fear and worry. Acts 27, since the story of Acts 27 encompasses the entire chapter, I'm just going to read a few selected verses as I relate to you quickly the story. This is a fairly detailed account for Acts 27 of the Apostle Paul's arrest. Now follow me. The Apostle Paul's arrest by the Roman military for, quote, causing a riot at the temple in Jerusalem. And so Paul is arrested. He is then put on a ship of prisoners, and they set sail for Italy. And the purpose of this trip is that they can get an audience with Caesar. Now, the first 9 verses of Acts 27, as they relate the details of this story, tell us what the theme of this journey is going to be. And the theme of this journey is severe weather. Now, walk with me through this, because it is wonderful and powerful how God meets these needs. Paul is on this prison ship, setting sail for Italy. Suddenly, the weather gets bad, really scary. Verse 10 of Acts 27 records that the Apostle Paul informs the sailors. He says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage is going to end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." Paul was saying, guys, this is getting bad. This weather is going to cause a shipwreck. And we're not only going to lose all cargo, but we may lose our lives. But the sailors did not pay any attention to him. As we follow the story, the winds became so violent that they blew the ship off course. In verses 18 and 19 of Acts 27, we find that the crew and the passengers began to throw cargo overboard. They get that concerned, they get that worried, that they began to lighten the ship and throw cargo, precious cargo, off the ship. In verse 20, we're told that the people aboard the ship soon lost all hope that they would be saved. So the story goes from a peaceful journey with prisoners aboard to severe weather, to violent storms, to everybody on board saying, we're lost. Our lives are doomed. Well, quickly, let's pick up the story in verse 22 of Acts 27. And Paul says to them, "I urge you now to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." And here's how he knew that. "For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe that God will make it be just as it was told to me. So they are abandoning the cargo. They are fearing for their lives. They've lost all hope. And Paul stands up and says, wait a minute. Last night, an angel of God spoke to me, and he said that we're going to make it. He appointed me to stand before Caesar. It's going to happen, and your lives are going to be saved. They're in the midst of absolute worry, of complete fear. An angel of God touches Paul and brings peace to his heart, and he shares that word with the others around. In the summer of 2007, my son was a sophomore, or he just completed his sophomore year in high school. He'd been invited by a team out of Wichita Falls, Texas, a select team, to play for them that summer. He had to stay in that area. They stayed in dorms and houses, and they played a hard schedule throughout the summer, and he could only come home on certain allowable times when the schedule allowed. Well, we missed him greatly. I bought him this old blue Chevy truck, and my heart sank as he took off, actually in Burke Burnett, right beside Wichita Falls, to stay up there for an extended time. Well, the day finally came when he was going to get to come home, his first visit. And man, I was excited, and Pam was excited. He couldn't leave until after they practiced. So it was early evening, I think around 5 o'clock or so, when he began the 4-hour journey, I think something like that, from Wichita Falls to Pampa. And I'll tell you the truth, I had forgotten this story. I've never shared this story publicly, except the night it happened in a prayer meeting. And I had literally forgotten about it until I went through the story of Paul and the ship and the severe weather. Because when my son started home in that old Chevy pickup, the weather got really, really bad. He was driving down 287 going west, and just ahead of him was a severe thunderstorm. And the severe thunderstorm got worse. I was watching it on the internet, a satellite picture of the storm, and I could see 287, the road that Ryan was traveling, and I could see this huge cloud. And I can't remember the name of the town. Childress. Right before Ryan got to Childress, Texas, a tornado broke through that little town. Destroyed homes. People were hurt. I was on the phone with the sheriff's office, with the Department of Public Safety. I was calling anybody and everybody that would pick up a phone and tell me what was going on, because my son was not far from there. A sophomore, just out of his sophomore year in high school, in an old Chevy pickup. They were shutting down some of the roads. They were trying to make a path through Childress that people could get through. And I stayed on the phone constantly with my son. Of course, he couldn't see what was ahead of him because he was back a period before the storm hit, and where the storm was pouring down. And so I anticipated, by watching the radar on the screen and keeping in touch with my son, I anticipated the spot at which he would encounter this terrible thunderstorm that had already produced a tornado. And I want you to know, I was terrified. I struggled with releasing my kids. And this was one of the worst, because he was an inexperienced driver. Pam and I worried over the decision to let him go and play in this league, and now he's coming home. I wanted him to wait, turn back, come the next day, but he wanted his mama's cooking, and he was coming home. And I anticipated the spot at which he would encounter that terrible storm. And I don't remember how my attention got distracted for just a minute. But when I turned back to look at the computer, right where I knew my son would encounter that thunderstorm, on the computer, that thunderstorm split. Before God, I'm telling you the truth. That thunderstorm, that cloud split on either side of Highway 287 just before he entered Childress, Texas. I called him and I said, son, of course he was a little tiffed at me because I'd called him about 48 times already. What, Dad? Because he didn't know what was upcoming. What, Dad? Son, what does it look like right in front of you? It's clear, Dad. Look to the right. It's really dark. Look to the left. It's really dark. But tell me again, what's right in front of you? It's clear, Dad. There's nothing there. And he drove right through it. I couldn't wait to get to prayer meeting that night and tell everyone what had happened. Now, looking back on it, 10 years plus later, 12 years later, I wonder what really happened, I mean, it's almost a surreal deal. Did that really, but it happened. And all I can tell you is that I think God saw a worried, deeply concerned, fearful father for his inexperienced driver son. And God sent an angel down that ladder. And the angel separated that cloud to bring peace to a really worried dad. I hope that brings encouragement to you. You young moms and dads, I hope that will give you a foundation for your faith, to know how deeply God cares and loves you, and how important is a father and mother's love for their children, and how God feels about that. I don't know where you are right now in your life, and I don't know what is going on circumstantially, situationally. But it well may be that your heart's cry this morning is for God to run an angel down that ladder and step right into your home.